Hi, everyone. I think we're live. Thank you all for coming and attending our webinar this evening. We're going to be talking about independent educational evaluations, which are also often referred to as IEEs. And we're going to be talking about how to understand them in the context of special education. My name is Francesca Corbus. I'm the Director of Special Education here at K. Altman Law.
My name is Melanie Roy. I'm one of the presenters here today. I'm a special education advocate here at K. Altman Law with 15 years experience in special education and advocacy. And I really love supporting families through the special education process. It's really a passion of mine, making sure that families, I can watch them go from anxious and agitated or overwhelmed to really able to make informed decisions about their child's educational needs.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Meeks, and I'm a licensed educational psychologist. And I'm so happy to be here today to talk about IEEs and evaluations. I work with a company called Cognitive Diagnostic Associates. And before that, I was in the schools for a very long time. So I'm happy to share some of my experiences from my time working in the school districts. All right, so a little bit about CDA. CDA is the largest special education company. And the cool thing about CDA is that we have all of the IEE assessors, independent educational evaluation assessors under one roof. So we have school psychologists, we have neuropsychologists, speech language therapists, physical therapists, occupational therapists, adapted PE, nurses, and optometrists available to collaborate and assess students when that IEE is something that you as a parent or the IEP team feels is appropriate. We're mostly in California right now. We have several offices in California. But we're expanding. We just opened an office in Texas and more coming in the future. So I did put our contact information on this slide if you're interested in learning more. A little bit about me. Like I said, I've worked in the schools for a long time in Southern California, both in Orange County and San Diego. I worked in the high school setting, preschool, elementary. So I got to see kids kind of in a lot of different settings in special day classrooms and learning centers, in gen ed. And I've assessed kids who have autism, who have learning disabilities, who have ADHD, all different types of things that can impact their academic performance. In addition, I'm also a parent. So I have two kids. I have an 8-year-old and an 11-year-old. So I have that perspective as well of what it's like just having kids and going through the school system and helping with homework and all that. So I have that. And another cool thing about me is I'm a marathoner. I love to run. And I've found that running and fitness is a great way to help with mental health. And that's kind of a discussion I always have with families when I'm assessing students, like what are your kids' interests? Is there something that we can include in their life that they can find a passion for, that can kind of relieve stress? That's really been a passion of mine for a long time. So here's all our information about CDA if you're interested in learning more. Again, happy to be here today and talk about IEEs.
Okay, so tonight we have objectives on what we will talk about, and we're going to be talking about 3 broad topics as they relate to IEEs in special education, starting with definitions and pertinent laws that are related to IEEs. So we'll understand the foundation of an IEE by learning what the definition of it is, and we'll learn the relevant laws that pertain to IEEs in special education. We're going to also talk about independent versus private evaluation. So IEEs are different than private evaluations, even though there are similarities. And we'll talk about which items each one has to offer and when each are appropriate. And then overall, kind of the meatiest part of our conversation will be the when, why, and how to request an IEE. So we'll talk about the timing of requesting an IEE. We'll talk about why it's important. And then we'll talk about the formal steps you can take to request an IEE.
We know we have a lot of you coming who are very familiar with IEEs, and we have some of you who have never heard the term before. So to make sure we have a clear grasp on the basics, we really want to go over some key definitions prior to digging deeper into what an IEE is and when to ask for one. So when we talk about an IEE, or an independent education evaluation, these evaluations are conducted by qualified examiners not employed by the school district. That way it's an unbiased third party to really dig deeper into your students' needs. It is paid for by the school district if certain conditions are met, and it can cover all types of special education evaluations conducted in schools, but that includes a list of a whole bunch here. This is not limited to the ones on this list, but think about social, psychoeducational, functional behavior assessments, speech language evaluations, occupational therapy, physical therapy, vision, deaf, hard of hearing assessments, assistive technology, and transition assessments as some of the main ones we hear about. Once you know what an IEE is, you have to recognize whether or not you qualify, if you're eligible. So a child must have already received or be considered for special education services, and the parents must make a request for the IEE if they disagree with the school district's evaluation. Digging now deeper into the laws that govern it, we have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, which governs evaluations in special education. When we look at that, we're thinking about, we know the school has a legal duty under child fine to identify, locate, and evaluate all children who may have a disability. An evaluation must be conducted whenever the school suspects that a student has a disability that may require special education services. And then reevaluations must occur at least every 3 years or more frequently if needed. Parents or teachers can request a more frequent evaluation, or if a student's needs significantly change, new diagnoses, new presentations. And then before making a significant change in placement, often we recommend evaluations to take place. Think we're transitioning from elementary school to middle school, or from a traditional school to a vocational school. These are good times to have evaluations to be able to build a solid plan to support the child. Also, if there are new concerns that arise that impact the eligibility or services, I think if your student has qualified under one category of special education, but now you suspect an additional disability or category that may need different supports. Evaluations must be timely, comprehensive, and not biased under these. When it comes to an IEE, parents have the right to request an IEE at the public expense if they disagree with this district's evaluation. The district must either agree to fund the IEE or file for due process to defend its evaluation. To be eligible, the student must fit under one of the federal categories for disability, and there are 13 to 14 of them, depending on what state you're in, whether or not they classify vision together or separate with blind, hard of hearing. Additionally, the medical diagnosis does not automatically mean eligibility. One category we often see this in would be autism. You can have a medical diagnosis of autism that is not impacting access to and progress within the curriculum. And this is a big sticking point a lot of times with schools, understanding as a parent, I have this medical diagnosis, but you're saying I don't qualify. What does that mean? How and why? IEs can help with that. Eligibility decisions are made by the IEP team based on comprehensive evaluative data. So if you disagree with the original evaluation sent to the school, that is when the IEE can come into play, because it's going to give you that comprehensive evaluation data to look at from an unbiased party. Evaluations guide whether a student presents with a disability and whether it adversely affects their educational performance, and then requires specialized instruction or related services in order for them to have access. Educational impacts are not just things like grades. It can look like communication skills, social, emotional, and behavioral needs, functional and adaptive skills, and motor skills. So think about if your student is doing really great in the ABCs and 1, 2, 3s of school, but is struggling in another area. It's not just that academic piece that is relevant. It is the whole child's educational needs, and educational really is a broad category.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the differences between an independent educational evaluation and a private evaluation. There are some overlaps as well. So an IEE is really a formally requested evaluation of a student's needs from a school district to kind of expand on maybe an incomplete assessment that the school did, or maybe the parent or the team felt it was not comprehensive. And this is a legal right of parents to request this. And you should be getting those procedural safeguards in your IEP meetings, and all the processes regarding that would be in that procedural safeguards document. And then the WHO is a qualified independent evaluator agreed upon by both the parent and the school district. And this would be relevant after a school evaluation occurs and parents are not satisfied or maybe don't agree with the assessment data for any reason. And then the pros for this would be that it's funded by the school district and it must be considered by the IEP team, and it's often pretty comprehensive. One of the cons would be that you must follow certain district procedures in getting the assessment, and the evaluator must meet district criteria. On the other side here, we have private evaluations. So that's a parent-initiated evaluation. Sometimes it's called like a medical model evaluation. Clinical sites can do these often. And one of the cons for this is that the evaluator often doesn't do a classroom observation. Sometimes they don't contact the school or include school records in the evaluation, which can be critical for looking at a lot of the things going on for the student. The pro could be that there's full control over the evaluator choice. So parent can pick whoever they want. And this can be done at any time the parent would like to have an evaluation done. All right, so this really covers what should be included in an IEE. So when I look at an IEE, one of the first things I really want to uncover is looking at a very involved records review. So the past IEPs, previous assessments that were conducted, really getting a look at the students' progress on goals. So with the IEP progress on goals, I'm looking at, are they meeting their goals? Is there any pattern with that? And that really is going to paint the picture whether that the current services, the current setting is meeting the students' needs. That's going to be going into the record review. And of course, just to back up here, there's all different types of IEEs. Sometimes it's a psychoed. As a psychologist, I do a lot of psychoeds, psychoeducational assessments, functional behavioral assessments. And in California, we have something called a SKIA, which is an assessment for one-on-one needs in the school, but in other states it's called different things. But that's really looking at the need for an aid or some kind of one-on-one support for the student. Occupational therapists, of course, and different specialties in the schools do an IE as well. So these are the different components that would be included in that, starting, of course, with the record review, parent and teacher input, observations, definitely wanting to get in there, look in the classroom, unstructured settings as well, recess, lunch. If it's a student who perhaps is on the spectrum, what are they doing during recess? Are they joining in with their peers? Are they sitting off to the sideline? That's going to be really helpful information going into the assessment. And of course, the one-on-one testing, looking at their intellectual ability, how do they process information? How do they interpret maps? How do they work with graphs and visuals? How do they, auditorily, are they able to hear the teacher's lecture and auditorily understand what they're hearing? Are they having any issues with memory? There's all different types of information that comes from the cognitive testing. Academics is, of course, important, looking at reading, writing, math, looking at not only standardized testing, but also their work samples. What are they producing in the classroom? Because that's going to have so much information as well. The standardized testing is only one part of it. It's really looking at what is actually going on in the classroom. Social behavioral functioning, that's going to be, getting input from parent and teachers on the rating forms. Attention, executive functioning, adaptive functioning sometimes is an issue, especially for our kids who have more moderate, severe disabilities, who might have trouble with self-help skills. That's going to really come into play. And then after all of this information is gathered, then the IE is going to be, all the data is going to be consolidated into a written report that's clear explanation of scores and findings for the parent, and then kind of integrating and coming up with some really practical, relevant recommendations. And for my assessments, I really want them to be something that the teachers and the school can kind of take and run with, meaning that they're practical things and also research-based. I really feel like that's an important part. There's lots of things going on in schools that seem great and they're everybody has good intentions, but sometimes they aren't the best strategies. They aren't the most research-based strategies. And of course, the diagnosis too, if that's relevant, that's included in the report.
So we're now going to get into some kind of real life scenarios of when you might feel triggered to request an IEE. So each of us is going to take a couple of these and talk about them. So Sarah, why don't you jump in?
So the first item here is it might be appropriate to request an IEE if you suspect the school's evaluation was incomplete. And I can kind of give an example of a scenario of that. So for instance, if you have it, maybe it's a eligibility evaluation and your student is entering middle school and there's some things that are changing and maybe the school had you fill out and the teacher fill out a social emotional screening assessment. A common one is called the BASC. And maybe anxiety was rated high on the screening assessment, but then the school kind of dropped the ball and they didn't really dig deeper. Maybe they didn't give any more assessment in that area, or they didn't ask any follow-up questions about that. This might be a good time to ask for an IE to look at anxiety and, dig a little deeper because they didn't really do their due diligence and kind of cover all areas of suspected disability and really understand what was going on with that elevated score.
Great. Yeah. And one of the things that you'll see streamlined throughout all of this is that we always tell parents to trust their gut instincts. So parents and guardians know their kids best. So while these reports are written by high level professionals and conducted by individuals who are highly trained, if a parent or a guardian feels that information is just not complete or doesn't show the full picture, it's important to understand this right to an IEE because there's a reason why they exist, and it's for that reason alone.
So for this next one, it really is a similar but different approach. So when you disagree with the results of the school's evaluation, that can be a great time to request an IEE. This can look like you're reading through the reports and it doesn't sound like it's describing your child. Maybe they got some pieces that do, but overall it leads to more questions than answers about how your child is doing within that environment, their strengths, their areas of need. So that would be a really great time to request an IE to dig deeper and learn more about your child's specific needs and specific strengths so that we can build an IEP that is truly going to serve their needs and lead to appropriate progress.
And another point here too, just to see streamlined throughout all this is with, for instance, a disagreement as to school's evaluation. It's understandable that you may not understand what the scores mean or that you may not understand what the diagnoses are, but you know that it just doesn't seem right. And that's when it's important to really seek support if you can, to whether it be an advocate or a clinician or someone who is an expert in understanding these reports, because they can tell you why they believe the report is not correct as well. Okay, so this one comes up a lot for us at K. Altman. So when the recommendations from the school's evaluation are too vague or not helpful, at the end of these reports, typically you see the recommendations, and that is what we as advocates always jump to, are the recommendations. What is this report telling the educators and providers they should be doing for the student in school? One thing that happens a lot is that they are too vague and they're not helpful. So they have really broad language. They don't explain further. One that we always use as an example is preferential seating for a student. That could mean many things. There is not a lot of context to that in and of itself. Why do they need preferential seating? What is it providing to them? Is it a sensory need? Is it an auditory need? There are many needs that could be serving. So the vague or not helpful recommendations are absolutely a red flag that you need more information.
I agree. And I would say if you feel like it's kind of a cookie cutter situation where maybe this is a list that's kind of generated and provided to most kids when they're coming up with recommendations, that listen to your gut. I feel like the recommendations should be very targeted and appropriate for the unique needs the student has, and something that is very individualized for them and specific, and also again research based for sure.
And they should match what's in the report. So a cut and paste job will be obvious if the report has much more information in it. This is another thing that we'll see sometimes too, is different children's names throughout the report too. That's kind of a sign that there's information that's being pulled from different sources. So just paying attention to those little items can make a big difference.
The next area is when you have concerns about the bias or the thoroughness of the school's evaluation. Sarah, what are your thoughts on that one?
Oh, that was mine. All right. So for this area, I have an example. So one example could be possibly like for English language learners, maybe the school used specific tests that were normed on students who, only spoke English. However, they didn't properly vet that out and explain that that's a language difference versus a language disorder. So that's one example that I can think of right now too. Or maybe perhaps, that you felt like there was some sense of like trying to preserve district resources and kind of overlook some specific things that were going on with the student, because they weren't, perhaps maybe your child has a mild learning disability and they need a specialized academic instruction, but they're kind of getting by in the classroom setting and they don't have any huge behaviors, and maybe those concerns were kind of minimized and you felt like there was a little bit of bias going on with the conclusions that were made in the report.
This can also swing the other way. Sometimes we have students who have a behavior need or a social emotional need that is significantly emphasized as the primary, when realistically there's an SLD or a cognitive disability that is impacting the student more so as the primary. And it doesn't sound like it really matters if we're addressing both needs, but when it comes from the lens of giving them the appropriate support to make progress, it can make a really big difference.
And to snowball off of what Melanie said, sometimes, that example that she gave with the behavioral piece, a lot of times schools understandably will be trying to nip in the bud the issues that are the most prevalent. So even if the others exist, if the behavior need is the most time sensitive, the most causes the most disruption, schools will try to focus on that first, when in reality, sometimes the other needs are what are exacerbating the behavioral needs. So identifying kind of the focus of those needs is important. Additionally, another area we see this issue in a lot is with SLDs and reading-based needs. So literacy-based needs are a hard need to serve, and one of the types of bias that you might see in testing is testing that heavily focuses on reading as opposed to verbal learning. So seeing the cognitive strengths of a student can be kind of hard, where there's, where when they should be assessed in an area where they can demonstrate their strengths more prominently. You guys have anything else to say about that one?
I don't think so.
I'm sure we could keep going, but we'll keep going with this. Okay, so when eligibility was denied for the school's evaluation. So this is what might happen after a parent formally requests an evaluation for special education in the first place. So it's before an IEP would even be in place. It's when a parent has the gut instinct, the suspicion to request a formal evaluation for SPED. And the process is run through, the evaluation is conducted, and at the end of it, the school conducts the discussion on whether or not the student should be found eligible, and they deny eligibility. This is the right time for many families to seek further information, because oftentimes similar to what we've said throughout. If the gut instinct is my kid cannot make progress, my kid really needs extra support in school, it's important to determine if there's further information that should be dug into. Sarah can speak really well to those additional subtests and assessments that might be added on to kind of the broader battery of tests that are offered up front, because sometimes it requires more digging to get to where those problems are coming from.
Yeah, and I would say also looking at not just the standardized testing, but what is going on in the classroom, because as we mentioned before, educational impact is broad. It's not just grades. It's not just academic scores on a test. It's the whole picture. How are they doing in their setting, and are they making adequate progress? So that really involves a very comprehensive assessment, because you're looking at multiple sources of data. It's not just one. And sometimes, you know, if a student does not qualify, perhaps it's, the assessment wasn't really looking at all those different sources of data. Another thing that I've kind of noticed, and I don't know if this is just a California thing, but there's, as you know, specific learning disability is one of the categories of eligibility, and there are some different ways to kind of analyze how a student meets eligibility under SLD. And we have response to intervention. Are they responding to school-based interventions? That's one kind of lens to look at it. Another lens is, we call it the discrepancy model. It's a little outdated.
Yep.
And so if there's kind of a discrepancy or a large difference between their cognitive ability, their intelligence, and then their academic performance, that's one way that another way that a student can qualify under SLD. And then the most, my bias, the best way to look at it would be looking at their strengths and their weaknesses. And, with a learning disability, it's really a profile of a student who has average intelligence, but they have a processing issue. Maybe they have a couple processing issues that impacts their academics. And there's a research-based link, for example, between a student who has a phonological issue, sound, letter sounds and things like that, and then their decoding skills. That makes sense why that student would struggle with reading. And so that's really a more appropriate method, I feel like, for analyzing specific learning disability. But the way the law is now, a school can use a discrepancy model to kind of justify if a student doesn't, meets eligibility under SLD. So I've had cases where the district chose to use the discrepancy model, and then an IEE was sought to kind of dig deeper, look at it from a different lens. And then we did find the student did have a learning disability. So that's kind of an example I've noticed personally of how this could be relevant, and how an IEE could bring a more comprehensive look at the situation and find out, yes, there indeed is a learning disability here.
Then another time to request an IEE would be if your child's needs are not being met and you want more data for the IEP team. A lot of decisions in the special education process are made in that team setting. And the more information we have, that knowledge is powerful. So if you or the team have reviewed all of the information you gleaned from the school testing, and there's more questions than there are answers, this is a really good time to ask for an IEE. We want the data and we want the information from these reports to sound like your child, and to give us some clear information on how to proceed, ideally. And if you don't have that clear information, an IEE really can support the team in getting information that they need to make informed decisions and to build really solid special education programming. All right, so we have thrown a lot of information at you, and we've got a few more things to do, but I just want to mention during this webinar, we do have a Q&A function and a chat function. If you have questions, we would love for you to put them in the Q&A while we run through the last few slides, and then we will dig into it and we will answer those questions as well. Try and keep the questions general so that we can answer them broadly to support the whole group. And if you have specific questions, you're welcome to ask them, but you might find that we hold off and answer those at a later time, to either ask you more questions to give you a meaningful answer, or to proceed with some confidentiality for you. So when it comes to looking at how to request an IEE, we have some clear steps that we recommend you follow here. And following these steps are going to ensure that the district is following and in compliance, and that you understand your rights. So the very first thing you're going to do, if you would like an IEE after the school has completed testing and you either disagree or have any of the concerns we've mentioned, you're going to put your request in writing. That means either an email or a letter that goes to the school, and you're going to state that you disagree with the district's evaluation and are requesting an independent educational evaluation at public expense. When you send that, you're then going to follow up with the district, because oftentimes they don't respond immediately. But they're required to respond to your request without unnecessary delay. So oftentimes we recommend send it via email and follow up within the same thread every week or more. Additionally, if the district denies your request for an IEE, they must file a due process hearing claim in order to show that their evaluation was appropriate, to prove it, right? So it's important for you to get the ball rolling with that request so that they will respond and they will choose to either grant you your request or move forward with due process to defend their evaluation.
All right, so why would you want to request an IE? There's a couple different things to consider. So it really helps ensure an understanding that your child's strengths and challenges are fully understood, and it brings in a fresh, objective perspective. So it's going to be somebody that doesn't have any knowledge of the case, somebody that's outside the school district would come in and kind of give another opinion on the matter. It can also uncover needs. So uncover anything that's been overlooked, such as any learning, attention, or social emotional needs that weren't captured in the school district's assessment. And it really ensures that an appropriate IEP is developed, because it strengthens your role as an informed advocate in IEP meetings and helps ensure the IEP is appropriate and legally defensible.
All right.
Okay. So we're going to get into the Q&A now. We have some questions already that I'm looking at in the chat. So I am going to read them out, and then whoever wants to grab them, grab them. We'll probably talk together, overlap, and I know we'll have a lot to say because we all clearly are passionate about this stuff. So our first question is it better to state the reasons you disagree with the district evaluation in your written response, or to basically just give a more broad statement that you disagree?
That's a great question. It really depends on their strategy behind it, right? So that can go one way or another. Typically, in general, I would say it's good to say why you disagree generally, and to share that information so that you can ensure the IEE addresses the appropriate areas of concern. That being said, if you're concerned that the process will not garner the right information, if you do disclose that, you can just say that you disagree and keep it very vague. But make sure you're very clear with the evaluator that is chosen about your areas of concern, because that's going to be what is most beneficial to your advocacy needs.
Absolutely. Yeah. So just again, off of what Melanie said, everything, at least from our lens as advocates, what we do is strategic. It really depends on the tone the school has set, the history of the relationship between the student, the family, and the school district. What kinds of needs have not been met historically, potentially. So sometimes if you put too much information in, it can limit what's potentially conducted in the IEP. And if it's too vague, it can give the school an opening to potentially object to the IEE. So that's why we kind of tailor those responses pretty strategically when we work with families. Okay, anything else? Okay, so we'll jump in again. Hi, thank you so much for this valuable information. Are we able to have access to the slides we see? They should be available. So with this webinar itself will be recorded. So the slides will be available if you want to run through the recording again.
We also
Okay.
provide all those that registered with a graphic one sheet that will kind of break down this information in a slightly more digestible individual format than the whole presentation would be. So you'll have some options for viewing it, but you'll have all the information and access to it.
Okay, so this is something that's kind of been referred to throughout this presentation, but it's a great question to get into more. Dyslexia is often overlooked in the evaluation of students, which can hinder the timely support necessary for those affected. How can we ensure the early identification of students with dyslexia in elementary education, thereby ensuring that they receive the appropriate interventions to enhance their academic success? Great question. Meaty question. Anyone want to start?
I can start with that one.
Yeah, okay.
All right, I'll start, and then Sarah, I'm sure, is going to add on.
Yeah, I'll add in
So
too.
one of the things I would say is time is important. So if you are noticing the impact or the fact that something is being overlooked, we don't want to wait and see. We don't need to use a wait and see model. So if you're concerned, you're going to ask for that IEE right away. You're going to want clear baseline data and growth information all along the way to ensure that that the child is being supported appropriately in that area.
And I would add too that there's a lot to dyslexia. It's very complex, and having a really good understanding of the type of dyslexia that the student demonstrates. So there's a few different types. So I would really look for an evaluator that has a good background with understanding dyslexia and provide a really thorough assessment of reading skills. In my practice, I really love diving in and really identifying what the type is, because the different interventions that align with the subtypes are going to be, you're going to want to have something that addresses the type of dyslexia that the student has. The interventions can look very differently if it's a phonetic issue, or if it's more than orthographic or surface dyslexia. So you're going to really want to have that information when you're planning your child's supports and services.
Sure. I just want to clarify something, because we had a question come through the chat from Tiffany, and she is a director of exceptional students. And I think that there's maybe a misunderstanding on how something was phrased. So we had mentioned that the parents and the district have to agree on an evaluator for an IEE based on district criteria. That doesn't mean that the parent can request any evaluator that they choose. It has to meet that criteria. So what Tiffany was mentioning, that as a SPED director, they often see board approved lists, and then you have to go through a procurement process to get a purchase order in place for the payment of that individual. And she's wondering if it is different state by state. Now, the criteria is different, often district by district, but that information needs to be accessible to the parents. And it definitely needs to be a mutually agreed upon person. So one area where there's technically often some friction is when the school does have a list and the parent comes with someone that is qualified, checks all of the boxes of the criteria, but is not on that list. That is the parent's legal right. They have every right to do that. They can't just pick a random person who maybe is a tutor without any qualifications and say, hey, this person's going to do an IEE on dyslexia. They have to be qualified and they have to meet that criteria. But if they do, they don't have to come from that list. Now, that doesn't mean they can't or shouldn't pick someone from the list. The list is often vetted people as well. But we find that it needs to be, or we know that it needs to be someone that is mutually agreed upon. Yeah, no, Tiffany heard us and she's saying, we don't want to make it seem like parents can pick anyone, right? It is really important that they meet specific criteria, and that the school district, you can't just get an IEE and then tell the district and expect them to pay. The first step is requesting it in writing and mutually agreeing on a person. That is really, really important. Thank you so much for bringing that up, Tiffany, because that piece could be really confusing for parents too.
Definitely.
So I really appreciate your lens, because that helps to make sure we're getting information out there that's really clear.
Absolutely. And it's kind of like everything else with IEP decision making. Parents and schools have to mutually agree and, be integrally related on a lot of items in the IEP process. Okay. How can a well-written IEE impact placement decisions and services provided? This is a good one. It can change the course of what an original IEP that was drafted, or even eligibility, can be turned around with further information. Diagnostic information can change the eligibility categories of the IEP. Service providers can be changed in an IEP. Sometimes placement. If a family really feels that a school placement or a school, determined placement is not appropriate, an IEE can help guide the team to make a different decision on placement. So many things can be impacted by an IEE.
And with that
Absolutely.
placement
Yeah.
piece, sorry, Sarah. With
Go
that
ahead, go ahead.
placement piece, I often see it go both directions. So we often hear the language of least restrictive environment, and I've seen an IEE help support a less restrictive environment, but I've also
Yes.
seen an IEE support a more restrictive environment based on that child's unique circumstances and needs.
Can you expand on that, Melanie? Like
Sure.
what
So
types of, yeah.
for example, we have a student who is in currently in the general ed setting and pulled out a few times a day, but is considered a general ed student for their placement. And the parents are advocating for a more restrictive placement. They feel the child is not making appropriate progress. The original school evaluation was like, nope, they're making adequate progress. Everything is fine. But when we did the IEE, we noticed the social emotional impact on being in that environment and having a big gap between their performance and the performance of their peers was having a huge impact on that person's self-esteem and self-worth. And then the trickle down of that was leading to more behaviors, was leading to more frustration, and eventually school refusal. So the parents were able to obtain a more restrictive placement where the child was able to make appropriate progress and not have a negative impact on their self-esteem, self-worth, and social, emotional, mental well-being. And in the opposite direction, where a student maybe is placed in a sub-separate classroom or a self-contained classroom, and they complete an IEE because the parents feel that the child would actually make more progress with more exposure to general ed and peers. And they were able to find through that IEE information about the social skills that were obtained and generalized in that setting that were not, there was no growth outside of that setting. So it did lead to the child was still placed in a self-contained setting, but had more access to general ed after receiving the IEE that had clear recommendations on what the child needed in order to make gains in that social skill area.
Yeah, and what Sarah, I don't know if you have anything further with the observation piece, but an observation can really help with that placement dispute too, about, how that student is actually making progress in their current placement. Or Sarah, do you ever conduct observations of a student in a potential placement?
Absolutely. So I've had a couple cases where maybe the parent placed the student in a non-public school or a private school. And so what I've done, and they feel like they needed to do that for their student's best interest. And so I've actually observed the student in that setting and then went and observed the offer of FAPE, the school district setting, and kind of compared and contrasted, and then interviewed staff from both settings. And that really kind of paints a picture like, okay, here's choice A, choice B, and, and aligning the assessment results and what the unique needs were identified in the report. And can those be met in the district's offer, or can they be met in the school setting? I try to really kind of dig in and compare and contrast both settings.
And to just plug Sarah's team and what they do, the reason why their team is also really valuable in the context of what K. Altman advocates and attorneys do is that we really need evaluations when we're supporting families that can strongly make the case for certain requests. And where an observation has been done in a report, we are given a really valuable tool to support a family if they go, for instance, to due process, to the formal legal dispute arena to hash out a dispute. So just first of all, a shout out to her team for what they do particularly for due process, because that's unique and valuable. But also when looking at a report, if there are, or we're looking to get an evaluation, if there are concerns about legal escalation, having that component of an observation in the context of placement can be really valuable, if not a make or break of whether or not you prevail. Okay, so we have a few more that we'll try to get to. We already answered a couple of them so far. So how long after an evaluation can I request an IEE? Who wants to answer this?
I can't.
Typically,
Okay.
okay, yep.
We'll have
Melanie.
Sarah go.
Okay, I hope I get this right.
That's okay. We're
I
here.
believe you can request it in the IEP meeting after you hear results from the assessment. You can voice it then or after the fact. I don't know if there's any length of time. I don't know if there's state law on that or if that's different in different states, but you guys
It
should
can
jump in on this
differ.
one.
No, that's a valid point. So in terms of how quickly, as quickly as you can, is what you want to do. If there's disagreement, you want to note it. You can absolutely verbally say it in the IEP meeting, but our recommendation is follow that up in writing as soon as that meeting's over and get that in time stamped in some way, whether it's a certified letter or an email, right? But then in terms of length after, there is some state variations. So it'll depend on your state, but one example is some areas it is, I believe you have up to a year or 16 months in some states to actually make the request. That being said, if we're talking beyond 6 months or more, every circumstance is individualized, but oftentimes 6 months or more, an IEE might not be the appropriate approach. You want to meet with the team and determine what other data has been gathered in that 6 months or could be gathered by the school team first, and then if there's continued disagreement, that IEE request after that. But you really don't want to push it out super far because a lot can change, and a lot of the disagreement, certainly things could get worse, but things could also get better. So you want to be very clear about gaining the information, especially when it comes to your own specific child, as quickly as you can, so that you can make informed decisions as soon as possible for that IEP. I hope that answers your question, Amy. If not, shoot us another question in the Q&A and we'll get to it.
Oh, this is a good one. So we might be rounding out the questions before we kind of wrap up, but this is a good one to at least potentially end on. What happens when the district denies a request for an IEE or simply ghosts you?
A lot, unfortunately. So realistically, the district can't and should not ghost you. They have to reply in a timely manner to your request. And they have two options. They can either say yes, or they can file for due process. Those are their options. So what we would recommend that you do is, again, you've already put it in writing and now they're ghosting you. You're going to follow up in the same thread or the same form of communication, and you're going to refer back to the times that you've reached out. So the first time you're going to say, hey, I reached out to you a week ago about this. I haven't heard anything. A couple more days go by. Hey, as I mentioned on this day, we reached out on this day. We still haven't heard anything. At that point, if you still are getting ghosted or concerned, you can either follow up and say, has the district decided to move forward with due process since we have not heard anything? Or what I would recommend is you reach out to an advocate such as Altman Law and ask for some support, because sometimes through no fault of your own, the schools aren't following the procedure like they should, and bringing in a little bit of muscle, so to speak, can help grease the gears and get things moving. But realistically, they have to respond. They can't just ghost you, and they shouldn't just ghost you. And if they do, we're here to help for sure.
Okay, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, if you had a question asked and we didn't answer it, do not stress. I will reach out to you afterward and get you an answer to your question. Okay.
As you can tell, we all love to chat, so we are here to dig into whatever is going on. We also really want to thank Sarah Meeks. It's been so nice to talk to you. Such a wealth of wisdom, and we know we'll be in contact again soon. And you all now know about Cognitive Diagnostic Associates too. So yes, can't say enough good things. So please follow up with us. Like Melanie shared, if any of this resonated with you, reach out and schedule a consultation. Our intake specialists will be the people to move you along. And you can use the reference code KALCDA 25 to receive a discounted intake session as a thank you. Also, feel free to leave a review if any of this was of value to you and you want to share what you enjoyed about the discussion. On this slide, you can see our direct contact information and a QR code to give the Google review. Otherwise, we are so thrilled that you came and enjoyed the presentation tonight, and we hope that you continue to come to these monthly webinars because we love to share information with this community of people.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you for having us.